Live with Mark Latham.
Welcome back to Jones & Co, where we're joined by Bettina, Arndt, our special guest. Bettina first rose to prominence in Australia as the nation's sex therapist in the 1970s, and since that time, particularly in recent months, she's conducted a lot of very, very important research in areas such as domestic violence. I've got to say, Bettina is the sort of guest we like to have on this show because she's willing to swim against the tide, she's willing to run against the herd and present factual, well-researched material that breaks the politically correct propaganda that we hear so much of in Australian politics. So, Bettina, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you, Mark.
You've done a lot of research in recent times about domestic violence, which is an ongoing important debate. What does your research show?
It's actually not my research. I've been looking at what research is out there. We have 40 years of research into domestic violence from all over the world, 1,700 peer-reviewed papers that all show the same sort of thing. They show that domestic violence is not what we always hear about, men terrorising women. Most violence in the home is two-way violence involving women as well as men. Yes, there are women who are, victims of men who are abusive, of course, but there are also men who are being abused by their wives, physically abused by their wives. And most children growing up in violent homes are watching this two-way violence where parents are having a go at each other. And we are being fed a lie in Australia. Malcolm Turnbull standing up there saying it's all about men's attitude to women. It's not. And we're seeing, Mark, you write about this a lot too. We see denial of the fact that there's this argument that's across every suburb in Australia, every community in Australia. Of course, that's not true. It's 60 times more common in some parts of Australia, poor areas of Australia, than the more affluent areas. There are a whole range of causes underpinning domestic violence we never hear about, such as mental illness and drug and alcohol abuse. We are hearing a tiny part of the story and a really manipulated, distorted view of what is an enormously important social issue. Yeah,
I worry about the propaganda that you've just mentioned, but I also worry about the political response because since the Gillard government formed a compact with the states on this issue about 6 years ago, we're now spending at federal and state level billions of dollars on domestic violence as an issue. But it seems to me the great bulk of the money is spent on awareness, advertising,
and propaganda
agencies that spread propaganda, politicians joining arms as they did in Canberra yesterday in one of the forecourts of Parliament House, awareness campaigns. This seems to me to be quite incongruous because surely everyone in Australia has an awareness of violence. Everyone knows what family violence is. So how can you actually get a result and solve the problem just through awareness when the country's already aware? It seems to me the awareness campaign is a bit of a Trojan horse
particularly when people know it's a lie.
There's propaganda, but the awareness campaign is often used by the left feminists to demonise men.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that's a major problem. It's causing a lot of resentment among men who are doing the right thing.
And women, and mothers, and brothers, and sisters of these men who are in abusive relationships, watching what's happening to the person, the man they love, and realising that if that guy goes along to the police, he's probably going to be laughed at and told to man up. If that guy is, tries to reach out for help, there's no help anywhere in Australia for male victims of violence. These hundreds of millions of dollars are all going to one side of the problem while we deny the complexity of this issue.
Look, I must admit that I agree with Mark's thesis that one of the problems is no male anywhere wants to look like they are unsympathetic to the genuine problem of domestic violence. And so, but I feel this is part of the objective is to intimidate the average bloke into a kind of silence and just to sit back and just take the belting that he's about to receive because of his membership of a class of male, which I felt got its big kick along. And I'm going to have a little crack at Malcolm Turnbull. You know, when we saw the Rosie Batty become Australian of the Year as a mother of a child who was, who was tragically and brutally killed by his father. But then we had Rosie, in effect, lobbying Malcolm to say, oh, well, violence is just the end result of a spectrum which begins with sexism, with just generic sexism, which all of these white males are guilty of. And once she managed to get Malcolm to buy into this idea that sexism which, you know, presumably may involve opening the door for a female or regarding the male and the female as different in some way, that this was the beginnings of violence.
But what happened to Rosie? I mean, she knows her husband was mentally ill. She will never say that publicly anymore. She'll never talk. Privately in seminars, she'll talk about mental illness, but she's been absolutely captured by this lobby group, which is arguing it's all about gender, it's all about attitudes to women. I mean, it's the most appalling sellout of her tragic story. And a lot of people are genuinely upset about what's happened to Rosie.
Well, tell us from the data, because my assumption is, and one of the things I find in this area is it's quite difficult to get data, Australian data, which has not been sort of homogenised, pasteurised and hermetically sealed by this sort of correct left orthodoxy. But my assumption is if you take out, you know, Aboriginality and remoteness, you take out substance abuse and addiction, you wind up with what's... The Australian male is not a particularly violent male if you take out that element of the pathology of violence.
And if we talk about domestic violence as what most people think of as domestic violence, which is, you know, being physically attacked, not psychologically abused, emotionally abused. I mean, we've got this ever-expanding definition, which is being used very deliberately to fudge the figures, to talk about an epidemic of violence, because you're including the whole kitchen sink in there. And 1.06% of Australian women are physically abused by their partner. I mean, when do we ever hear that figure? I mean, Mark, in fact, was one of the person who dug that out from the ABS, and it was very hard to get them to admit to that. But most Australian women live with men who respect them and look after them, not with abusive men. And it does such a disservice to the men of Australia, to the boys of Australia, to be told that they're all part of this problem and they're all potential abusers. That is simply not true.
Bettina, you've looked at some of the state jurisdictions to see how the pendulum is swinging, particularly in the burden of proof. Is that right in Western Australia now, that if a woman alleges control or intimidation by the male partner, that the partner will automatically be arrested?
Well, he can be. I mean, the police minister in Western Australia last week talked about the fact that they're erring on the side of the victim, that their new laws are all about setting up the victim so that she has it more likely to be able to prove her case. And therefore, the alleged perpetrator has less and less standing under the law. And so you don't even have to have domestic violence. You don't even have an allegation of violence. You can just say, I'm afraid that because he's controlling or intimidating me in some way, that could lead to violence. That's enough.
So the whole burden is shifting...
The burden's shifting in
to the disadvantage of men.
Absolutely.
In a way that we would never have accepted in the past, in the impartiality, the theoretical impartiality of the judicial system.
And we're seeing across Australia now the premiers, the lawmakers competing to set up laws that are disadvantaged men.
And what's happening in Victoria? Is that right that a male victim of domestic violence, the authorities will now contact the partner to find out whether or not it's true?
That's been happening for a while now. I was just gobsmacked when I heard this. A male, speaking at a conference on suicide, said that when men ring up who are suicidal because they're in a relationship with an abusive woman, the police are called in to track down his partner, to question his story. I mean, and everybody there at this conference was just gobsmacked because they said, you know, where's the law, where are the privacy regulations? Where's the duty of care to that man? And now the Victorian government has announced they're going to change the privacy regulations to toss them out so that we can protect the victim and we can assume that any man who comes forward as a potential victim of violence may in fact be the perpetrator. That is how the Australian framework, official framework for domestic violence, has now been set up, to assume that all male victims might be perpetrators. And in New South Wales, I mean, amazing thing, Prue Goward announced in June she was giving the first ever funding for male victims of violence, a piddling 13 million over 4 years compared to the hundreds of millions that are being spent on, you know, women victims. But this was a good thing. They've turned out and they've given the bulk of that money so far to an organisation called the Men's Referral Service, which for many years denied there was even such a thing as a male victim of violence. And then finally they came around a bit and said, oh, well, they're male victims, but it doesn't affect them in the same way, so we don't really need to support them.
This is the outfit that's got the contract to look after the men.
They've got the contract, which didn't even go to tender, open tender. They got the contract, so the fox is in charge of the hen what is it? Hen house. And men have to go through this hostile, the men who come in as victims have to go through this hostile screening process, which assumes they're probably perpetrators. I mean, what is this?
The question I want to ask you, Bettina, because I know you first came to fame, you know, as the editor of Forum, pretty racy, but you've given a lot of advice to individuals about finding a partner, both men and women, and you've got a certain expertise in that area. One of my concerns is that if you were to rank the impact on the society of isolation, loneliness, of the inability to find a partner, of the inability, for example, we know that if you're a tertiary educated white Australian female in a capital city, you've got about 1 chance in 3 or 1 chance in 4 of never finding a partner and never becoming a mother, even though you want to. We're not talking about women who decide not to. So you've got all these people falling through the cracks into a kind of social isolation and loneliness. And at the same time, we are loading up the male gender with this demonised, sort of despotic, brutal, violent character. I'm not sure it's helping Australian men and women to find each other when they really need to.
And men are looking at the costs of being in a relationship. And there's a group of men who are deciding it's all too hard, it's all too dangerous. I mean, why would you commit to caring for your beloved children when you're so at risk? If the woman decides the relationship ends, she can allege he's been violent to her, she can have him locked out of the house, she can have him arrested, she can have, you know, him denied contact with his children. We are setting up the law to give more and more power to the woman in that situation, and sometimes women misuse that power. Years and years ago, I was writing about family law and about the problem a lot of men had, this was back in the 1980s, of having contact. You know, a lot of the children were having trouble seeing their dads in that situation. I had a retiring family court judge who came to me, who wrote to me and said, you know, we made a big mistake, the way we set up the whole family law system. We gave too much power to the custodial parent, which was almost always the woman in that case, and there are some women who misuse that power. Now, in Australia, we're setting up laws across the country that give women enormous power to do men in, if they've had enough of those men. And there are going to be women who misuse that power, and that is happening everywhere.
Let me ask you one other question. We have seen now this big move on the back of this broad spectrum orthodoxy that males are violent, that we should create a new industrial entitlement to domestic violence leave. And naturally, the first organisation to really go into it in a big way is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where apparently every single staff member of the ABC requires 10 days a year to recover from the effects of domestic violence. Now, I always thought the orthodoxy was if you were in a violent relationship, you should leave the relationship, whereas I understand the ABC view is if you're in a violent relationship, you should take 10 days leave from the ABC to recover from. Now,
well, to go and
what is the risk? Are we
it.
just normalise? Is the ABC just normalising violence by creating an industrial award for it?
Well, what they're doing, I mean, as if an employer is in a position to say, are you sure you were abused? You know, no employer would dare question, what are we talking about here? And what does the violence include? Does it include him saying something nasty to her or not wanting her to spend all of his income or whatever it is? I mean, financial abuse.
Well, it's being defined to include sexist jokes, the way you drive a car. I mean, if you look at the definitions of domestic violence, it covers just about every aspect
unions are mounting a huge case
of a troubled relationship
for domestic violence leave across Australia. And no one is really saying, what are we talking about here? How can an employer possibly question a woman's word on this. We don't question a woman's word on this in any context.
100% of leave applications will be granted. That's the reality, isn't it?
And if a woman goes into a police station, no one asks what the evidence is that she's been abused. She can say, I was afraid he might hurt me, and that's enough. She can get an AVO. It'll give her, you know, there are magistrates, there are judges, there are lawyers across the country who will acknowledge this is being, there are false allegations being made to give strategic advantage in family law cases.
I think originally a lot of politicians got into this debate thinking it was good for the female vote. You know, when you're raising awareness and running advertising campaigns and essentially it's symbolic, you're linking arms, you're not really expecting a hard, tangible result in society. So politicians got into this thinking that here's a way to get the female vote. But there's no doubt now that the pushback against it, the resentment among men, it means that parties are losing an important constituency, the male vote. Now, a lot of the Australian trends here follow what's happened in the United States. The key statistic in the Trump election was that in 2008, Republican candidate John McCain got 49% of the white, non-college educated male vote. And Trump got 68%. 8 years later, got 68%. So a 19% swing to the Republicans for white, non-college educated men. So it's a huge constituency, a huge voting power, and it swept him into office. And I think, you know, basically men talk to me about this and related issues just about everywhere, at sporting grounds, the racetrack, shopping centres, schools, and they know what's going on. They're very articulate about it, and they've got a quiet determination to express themselves through the ballot box. So
about time
this has got to be a rising issue, hasn't it?
It absolutely does. I mean, men notice that everyone's lobbying for gays. I mean, it's all this identity politics, you know. Women, you name it, everybody gets votes and carrots thrown at them. The only person that nobody cares about are heterosexual white men. I mean, they are never mentioned. And as we've said, the laws are being increasingly stacked against them in all sorts of situations. And they're noticing. It's interesting, we have men's issue groups springing up on the internet all over, you know, international conferences starting up. Australia is really well known for this groundswell of activity that's been going on for years now, where more and more Australian men are joining these organisations. We're having a big international conference here next year on men's issues where international speakers are coming. I think we're going to see some change in Australia, but we're already beginning to see it, as you say, Mark.
Yeah. Well, the media don't get it, though. Just yesterday in the Sydney Morning Herald, Jessica Irvine wrote as follows: "Make no mistake, the rise of the political parties led by Donald Trump and Pauline Hanson are part of a backlash against the advancement of women and minorities into the workforce and the overturning of traditional male breadwinner models." So what she's saying is because women are getting better jobs and men relatively are getting worse jobs, this is part of the male backlash. But it's not that at all, because most men, Ross and myself included, have got daughters, and we welcome rising female participation rates and opportunities. We welcome the fact that 60% of university graduates in Australia each year are female. We want that for our daughters. We want the very best career for them. The backlash is not about changes in the workforce. It's about the demonisation of men, false allegations being made in the domestic violence debate, and the fact that in identity politics, white men are left out of all the considerations and are now, you know, quite unusually enough, are classifying themselves as disadvantaged. White men now see themselves in the media debate and the political debate as the disadvantaged group.
That's why they're concerned. And not just the men. I mean, of course, Trump got plenty of females voting for him too. And these are the mothers and the sisters and the, you know, the families of men who they see being done over. Yeah. And the same happens here. I get just as many letters from women as I do from men saying, what is happening here? Why was Malcolm Turnbull out there, you know, promising all this stuff to women and not giving us stuff about men? I mean, why are all the politicians in this bidding war to try to win the women's vote? We don't want that. We want men and women in violent situations to be protected, not just women. We want children in violent homes to be protected. And the person they're most at risk from, of course, is their mothers. I have women writing to me saying, my mother was abusive. No one wants to hear about that.
Yeah, I just think my assumption is if we really cared about domestic violence, one of the reasons why I have never bought this sort of left new industrial machine that we're about to build is because of the decades of neglect of Indigenous violence towards women in remote communities, for which I must admit I largely blame the Commonwealth for creating this massive welfare edifice which fuels the drug and alcohol, the ice, at the extremity of which there's no amount of ads on, you know, primetime TV when the bloke he hasn't had a job in his life, he's fully tanked, he gets home after the check has come in and he's blown the lot at the pub, and at 11 p.m. he looks down on his girl in complete moral defeat as a human being. He's saying, oh, yeah, I just saw that ad on TV. No, I'm going to be gentle to it. I mean, it's rubbish. It does not work.
Similarly, the drunken woman or the woman on ice, I mean, we all know she's there. And do we really think she turns into an angel when she's at home? No. I mean, people aren't mugs. They realise the lies that have been told about this issue. I mean, I was out in the cattle country in the middle of Queensland, cattle country, the other day, talking to a policewoman who said she goes into all these homes you've been talking about, and she sees some incredibly violent women as well as men. She sees children cowering from their mothers as well as their fathers. I mean, this is an issue where we need to stop the lies and look at what's actually going on.
Well, we could talk to Bettina Arndt for the rest of the evening. She's a lucid and charming guest of Jones & Co. It's been a pleasure having you on board. We hope we're going to let Bettina go, but we hope you will stay with us for the final segment of the year for Jones & Co.
This is Jones & Co. on Sky News Live.